My name is Choice Isaac. I'm 30 years old. For a decade, my family called me the Drifter, while my sister Savannah collected social status and my parents constant praise. They mocked my unstable career as an architect, left me out of every family vacation, and treated my hard work like a lucky accident. But on the night of Savannah's grand housewarming at my coastal estate, in front of the town's wealthiest socialites, I walked through the front door with a document that would strip the roof from over their heads. What they didn't know was that while they were busy spending my grandfather's money, I was the one who saved his legacy. And I held the only piece of paper that could turn their perfect life into a legal nightmare. The Isaacs were coastal royalty, the kind of family that owned the town's oldest marina and expected everyone to bow when they walked past. My father, Silas Isaac, spent 40 years trying to act like a mogul while slowly bleeding out the wealth my grandfather, Arthur, had built from a single fishing boat in 1978. By 2026, the family estate was valued at $1.2 million, but it was held together by nothing but secrets and debt. I was born with a people-pleasing streak, a quietness that my parents mistook for weakness. I saw the world in blueprints and load-bearing walls, a language my family refused to speak. While Savannah was being groomed for the spotlight with expensive debutante balls and business degrees, I was working 2 jobs and studying until 3 a.m. to get my architectural license. My parents' response to my success wasn't pride. It was a demand. Choice, my mother would sigh. You've always been so independent. It's only fair that you help your sister get her footing. At 22, I almost believed them. So, I learned to build my own foundation in secret. The salt air usually smelled like home, but today, it felt like a warning. I pulled my rental car into the gravel driveway of the cedar-shingled cottage on Blackwood Cliff, the engine ticking as the silence of the coast settled around me. I had been away for 2 years, enduring 18-hour days in London's most prestigious architectural firm, all to earn the right to come back to this, my sanctuary. But the sanctuary felt wrong before I even stepped out of the car. The front yard, once a wild, intentional garden of sea lavender and dune grass, had been razed. In its place was a flat, sterile slab of expensive sod and a row of manicured hedges that looked like they belonged in a suburban country club, not on a rugged cliffside. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then there was the silence. Barnaby. I called out, my voice cracking. Barnaby, come here, boy. Barnaby was a golden retriever with a coat the color of honey and a habit of sleeping on the porch the moment he heard a car turn onto the lane. He was 13 years old, half blind, and the only living thing that had never asked me for a favor. He should have been barking. He should have been limping toward me with a wagging tail. The yard remained still. The doghouse I'd built by hand sat empty in the corner, a child's plastic tricycle overturned beside it. I walked up the porch steps, my palms sweating. I reached into my bag and pulled out my brass key, the one I'd kept in a velvet pouch for 700 days. I slid it into the deadbolt, expecting the familiar heavy click of the tumbler. The key didn't even go in. I tried again, pushing harder, my breath coming in shallow hitches. The lock was new, a sleek, brushed nickel smart lock with a glowing keypad. My hand dropped to my side. I hadn't authorized this. I hadn't even been told about it. I pressed my face to the glass of the sidelight window, and my stomach performed a slow, sickening roll. My minimalist living room, filled with the sketches and drafting tables of my life's work, was gone. In its place was a plush, white sectional sofa I didn't recognize. A massive television was mounted where my grandfather's antique bookshelf used to stand. Then, I heard it. A high-pitched, feminine laugh drifted from the kitchen. Savannah's laugh. It was followed by the heavy, booming voice of my father, Silas. The appraisal should be in by Friday, he was saying, his tone rich with a satisfaction he hadn't earned. Once we clear out the rest of the junk in the back room, this place is going to be the crown jewel of the coast. I didn't knock. I pounded on the door, the vibration rattling my teeth. Savannah. Dad. Open this door right now. The laughter stopped. Footsteps approached, hurried and light. The door swung open, and there stood my sister, draped in a silk robe that cost more than my first car, holding a glass of chilled Chardonnay. She didn't look surprised. She looked annoyed. Choice, she said, leaning against the frame as if I were a solicitor. You're back early. We weren't expecting you until the weekend. Where is my dog, Savannah? I choked out, my voice trembling with a fury I couldn't contain. And why is my key not working in my own front door? Savannah took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes scanning me with a pity that felt like a slap. Don't be dramatic. We're just getting settled. And as for the dog, Dad said he was getting in the way of the kids. He's at the shelter, Choice. It was for the best. The world tilted. They hadn't just moved in. They had erased me. The air in the hallway was thick with the scent of expensive candles and roasted garlic, the smell of a celebration I wasn't invited to. I pushed past Savannah, my boots heavy on the reclaimed oak floors I had sanded myself 3 years ago. Every step felt like a trespass in my own home. In the dining room, my parents sat at the head of the mahogany table. My father, Silas, didn't look up from his plate of seared scallops. My mother, Lydia, was adjusting a crystal centerpiece that had replaced my collection of architectural hand drafts. Choice, my mother said, her voice tinkling like wind chimes. You're just in time for the second course. Savannah, fetch another setting for your sister. One of the everyday plates will do. I don't want a plate, Mom, I said, my voice vibrating with a frequency I didn't recognize. I want to know why Savannah's kids are sleeping in my drafting studio and why my grandfather's library is sitting in a dumpster at the end of the driveway. My father finally looked up. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, his expression hardening into the patronizing mask he'd worn since I was a child. Lower your voice, Choice. You're upsetting the children. We've had a long talk while you were drifting around Europe. This house is far too large for one person who's never here. I wasn't drifting, I snapped. I was on a fellowship. Working. To pay for the taxes and the upkeep on this property. Things you haven't touched in years. That's exactly the point, Savannah chimed in, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed. You're always working. You don't have a family, Choice. You don't have roots. I have 3 children who need a yard and a school district. It was selfish of you to keep this place locked up like a museum while we were struggling in that cramped apartment. Selfish. I felt a laugh bubble up in my throat, bitter and jagged. I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. It belongs to me. My mother sighed, a sound of practiced disappointment. We all spoke to the family attorney, dear. Or at least, the one your father uses. He explained that since this was family land, and since you've effectively abandoned it for 2 years, the occupancy rights revert to the primary heirs. We've decided that Savannah will take over the deed. It's only fair. Fair. I looked from one face to the other. They were glowing under the soft light of the chandelier I had installed with my own hands. They looked so certain, so entitled to the walls I had reinforced and the roof I had repaired. We'll give you a small payout for your troubles, my father added, reaching into his vest pocket as if to pull out a check. A fresh start. You've always liked moving around, haven't you? This just gives you the freedom to do it without the burden of a mortgage. You forged it, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The permission letter. The trust. You lied to the bank. Savannah smirked, a sharp, ugly look that stripped away her polished exterior. Prove it, Choice. You've been gone for 2 years. Everyone in this town thinks you've moved to London for good. We're the ones living here now. We're the ones the neighbors see every morning. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Isn't that what they say? I looked at the table, at the stolen life they were enjoying at my expense. My people-pleasing instinct, the one that had kept me quiet for 30 years, screamed at me to walk away, to avoid the scene, to just let them have it to keep the peace. But then I thought of Barnaby at the shelter. I thought of my sketches in the trash. You're right, I said, my voice suddenly dropping to a calm, terrifying silkiness. Possession is important. I think I'll go to a hotel tonight. I wouldn't want to be in the way of such a festive family dinner. Savannah's smile widened, triumphant. I knew you'd understand, Choice. You always were the sensitive one. As I turned to leave, I felt the heavy weight of the small, encrypted USB drive in my pocket, the one linked to the hidden security cameras I'd installed in the rafters before I left. They thought they had erased me. They didn't realize I'd been watching the whole time. The hotel room felt like a sterile cage, but it was the only place I could think clearly. I sat on the edge of the bed, my laptop glowing in the dark, and pulled up the remote feed from the cameras I'd hidden in the crown molding of my studio. These weren't for security against burglars. I'd installed them 2 years ago because I knew, deep down, that my family's boundaries were as porous as sea foam. I scrubbed through the footage from 3 days ago. My stomach twisted as I watched Savannah and my mother tossing my hand-carved architectural models into heavy-duty trash bags. They weren't even careful. They snapped the delicate balsa wood trusses of my award-winning bridge design like they were kindling. Just junk, Savannah's voice crackled through the tiny speakers. She thinks she's so sophisticated with these little toys. She can build a new one in London if she cares so much. Then I saw it. My father walked into the frame holding a clipboard. He began tagging my professional drafting station, my high-end plotters, and my $8,000 laser cutter with neon orange stickers. The estate sale starts Saturday, Silas said, his voice flat and clinical. The auction house said we can get at least $20,000 for the lot. That should cover the first 3 months of the kids' private school tuition. I closed the laptop, my breath hitching in my throat. They weren't just living in my house. They were liquidating my life to fund a lifestyle they couldn't afford. The next morning, I drove to the industrial park on the edge of town, where a low-slung brick building housed the archives of the county's oldest law firm. I didn't call my father's attorney. I went to see Mr. Henderson, the man who had been my grandfather Arthur's executor, and my secret co-conspirator. "Choice," he said, rising from behind a desk piled high with yellowing folders. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and grim determination. "I heard you were back. And I heard about the renovations at the Cliff House." "They think they own it, Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice finally finding its steel. "They told me the occupancy rights reverted to them because I abandoned it. They even mentioned a letter of permission." Henderson reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored folder. "Your father tried to file a notice of abandonment and a claim of kinship 6 months ago. He presented a letter supposedly signed by you, giving them power of attorney over the property." "I never signed anything." "I know you didn't." Henderson slid a document across the desk. It was the original deed from 2020. Because a ghost can't grant power of attorney to a third party when the property was never part of the estate. Your grandfather didn't leave you this house in his will, Choice. You bought it from him for $1 and valuable consideration. The consideration being that you paid off the $400,000 lien your father had secretly placed against it. I looked at my own signature next to my grandfather's shaky script. We had kept it private to spare my father the shame of his bankruptcy. My kindness had been the very thing they used to build their lie. "What do I do?" I asked. Henderson leaned forward, a sharp glint in his eyes. "You let them have their party. Savannah is hosting a coastal heritage gala tomorrow night to announce her inheritance. Let her stand in front of the town and claim it. I'll have the sheriff and the real papers ready at 9 p.m. sharp." The memory of that night in 2020 felt like a ghost limb, heavy, phantom still, and full of a dull ache. My grandfather, Arthur, had been sitting in his wingback chair by the fireplace, the orange embers reflecting in his spectacles. The room smelled of old pipe tobacco and sea salt. Outside, the same Atlantic waves that were now lulling Savannah's children to sleep were crashing against the cliffs. "They don't see the house, Choice," he had whispered, his voice as thin as parchment. "They see an ATM. Your father, he's a good man in his own mind, but he's a hollow one in his heart." He had slid a manila envelope across the scarred oak table. Inside were the foreclosure notices, 3 of them, stamped in a terrifying, aggressive red. My father had used the family home as collateral for a surefire marina expansion that had collapsed before the first piling was driven. He hadn't told anyone. He was prepared to let the bank take the roof off his own father's head rather than admit he'd failed. "I have the savings from my first 3 years at the firm," I had told him, my heart hammering. "And I have the inheritance from Grandma. It's exactly $400,000. It's enough to clear the line." Arthur had gripped my hand, his skin feeling like dry leaves. "If you do this, they'll hate you for it. They believe they are entitled to the fruit without ever planting the tree. If you save it for yourself. Buy it from me. $1 and the debt cleared. We'll keep the deed in Henderson's vault." "Why the secret, Grandpa?" "Because," he'd said, looking toward the door as if he could hear my father's heavy tread in the hallway, "if Silas knows you own it, he'll spend the rest of his life trying to guilt you into giving it back to him. He'll call it family when he wants something, and business when he owes something. You keep the paper. You keep the power. Only use it when the foundation starts to crumble." I had signed the papers that night under the dim light of a floor lamp. I had promised him I would keep the Isaac legacy standing, even if I had to stand in it alone. The memory flickered and died as I sat in my hotel room. The modern LED lights hummed overhead. I looked at the digital clock. 6 a.m. The day of the gala had arrived. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for the local animal shelter. "My name is Choice Isaac," I said, my voice cold and focused. "You have a golden retriever named Barnaby. He was brought in by a man named Silas Isaac. I'm coming to get my dog. And then, I'm coming to get my house." The shelter smelled of cedar shavings and heartbreak, but when Barnaby saw me, the years seemed to melt off his graying muzzle. He didn't bark. He just leaned his entire weight against my shins and let out a long, shuddering sigh. I lifted him into the back of my car, his tail thumping against the upholstery, and felt the last tether of my people-pleaser's guilt snap. I drove straight back to Mr. Henderson's office. He was waiting with a magnifying glass and a digital scan of the living trust my father had filed with the county clerk. "Look at the signature, Choice," Henderson said, pointing to the bottom of the third page. "The C in your name has a distinct loop. You've always drawn it like an architect. Precise, geometric. But here." He traced a shaky, fluid line. "This is your mother's handwriting. She used to sign your school permission slips exactly like this." I stared at the forgery. It wasn't just a lie. It was a betrayal of my childhood. They hadn't just stolen a house. They had stolen my identity to do it. "They also filed a statement of intent to sell personal property," Henderson continued, sliding a second paper over. "They've categorized your professional equipment as abandoned debris. By labeling it that way, they bypass the standard waiting period for an estate sale. The auction is set to go live online tonight at 9 p.m., right when the gala is in full swing." "They're selling my career while they sip champagne," I whispered. "Not if the sheriff serves a stay of sale, along with the eviction," Henderson replied. He picked up his desk phone and dialed a direct line. "Sheriff Miller. It's Henderson. I have the original 2020 deed and the affidavit of forgery ready. We'll meet you at the Blackwood Cliff Gate at 8:45. Make sure the deputies have the trespass notices printed." I spent the afternoon at a local boutique, buying a dress that cost more than my first drafting table. It was midnight blue, structured like a skyscraper, and sharp enough to draw blood. I wasn't going back to that house as the drifter daughter was coming home for a handout. I was going back as the landlord. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long bruised shadows over the Atlantic, I parked a block away from my house. The driveway was clogged with valet attendants and black SUVs. String lights twinkled in the trees I had planted, and the sound of a jazz trio drifted over the cliffside. I looked at Barnaby in the rearview mirror. "Wait here, boy. I'm going to go get our keys back." I walked toward the gate, the deed tucked into a silk clutch, feeling the weight of the foundation finally shifting back to where it belonged. The driveway was a gauntlet of sparkling German sedans and valets in white gloves. I didn't give them my keys. I simply walked past the velvet ropes, my heels clicking on the stones I'd laid myself during a sweltering summer 5 years ago. The house was glowing. Every window was a lantern of warm, golden light, and the scent of jasmine, Savannah's favorite, and a scent I found suffocating, drifted out from the open French doors. A large, professionally printed sign stood at the entrance. The Isaac Estate, a celebration of legacy. I felt a surge of cold fury. My legacy was a pile of balsa wood in a dumpster. Theirs was a stolen stage. I stepped through the threshold, and the chatter of the town's elite hit me like a physical wave. The minimalist aesthetic I'd spent a decade perfecting had been buried under layers of velvet drapes, gilded mirrors, and coastal chic clutter. It looked like a showroom for people who had more money than taste, or in my family's case, more debt than dignity. Choice. I turned to see my mother, Lydia, fluttering toward me in a gown of shimmering champagne silk. She held a flute of crystal, her eyes widening as they swept over my midnight blue dress. For a second, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her face, replaced instantly by the practiced mask of a gracious hostess. "You came," she whispered, leaning in as if we were sharing a secret. "Though, dear, you really should have checked in. This is a private event for the Heritage Society. Savannah has worked so hard on the guest list." "I'm sure she has," I said, my voice as steady as a structural beam. "It's amazing what you can achieve when you're using someone else's resources." "Don't be sour," my mother hissed, her grip on my arm tightening. "Savannah is announcing her new foundation tonight. A scholarship for young mothers. It's a beautiful thing. Just stay in the background, Choice. Don't ruin this for her. I pulled my arm away and scanned the room. Savannah was at the center of a circle near the fireplace, holding court with the mayor and a local real estate mogul. She looked radiant, the picture of inherited grace. Then I looked toward the back hallway, where my father, Silas, was showing a group of men toward my studio. And through here, I heard him say, his voice booming with false authority, we're clearing out the old storage to make room for a private tasting cellar. We've got an auction ending at 9 tonight for the remaining industrial scrap. I checked my watch. 8:32 p.m. I didn't stay in the background. I walked straight to the catering station, picked up a silver spoon, and tapped it against the side of a crystal bowl. The sharp, clear ring cut through the jazz and the gossip. The room fell silent. Savannah looked up, her smile faltering. My father froze in the studio doorway. Good evening, everyone, I said, projecting my voice the way I used to during high-stakes project pitches. I'm Choice Isaac. And before my sister makes a big announcement, I think it's time we talked about the real history of this house. Savannah's glass didn't shatter, but the silence that followed my voice felt just as jagged. She stepped forward, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood. Choice, honey, she said, her voice strained with a high, melodic artificiality. I know jet lag is hitting you hard, but this isn't the time for your creative stories. Why don't you head to the guest wing? I'll have a server bring you some tea. A few guests chuckled nervously. My father, Silas, moved from the studio doorway, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of plum. That's enough, Choice. You're making a scene. Step into the library. Now. I'd love to, I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room. But the library was hauled away in a dumpster yesterday, wasn't it? Along with 10 years of my professional archives. The murmurs in the room sharpened. The local real estate mogul narrowed his eyes, glancing between me and the estate sale tags still visible on the equipment in the background. Security. Savannah called out, her poise finally snapping. 2 hired men in black suits appeared from the foyer. My sister is having a medical episode. Please escort her out. Gently, but immediately. The guards moved toward me, their shadows long under the chandelier. One reached for my arm, but I didn't flinch. I simply held up my phone, the screen glowing with a countdown timer. 0:03, 0:02, 0:01. Right as the clock hit 0, the heavy front doors, the ones they'd changed the locks on, thudded open. Sheriff Miller stepped into the light, flanked by 2 deputies. The jazz trio stopped mid-note. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Sheriff, my father said, trying to summon his boardroom bark. Thank God you're here. My daughter is trespassing and disrupting a private function. I want her removed and charged. Sheriff Miller didn't look at my father. He looked at me, then at the heavy, notarized folder in his hand. I have a report of a trespass, Silas, the sheriff said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. But according to the county registrar and the original 2020 deed, the owner of this property is standing right there. He pointed his gloved hand at me. That's a mistake. Savannah shrieked. We have the living trust. Our parents gave us this house. The living trust you filed contains a forged signature, the sheriff continued, stepping further into the room as guests began to back away toward the walls. And I have a stay of sale order for the items in that studio. Everything in this house is under a legal freeze effective 5 minutes ago. I looked at Savannah, whose face had gone as white as her silk gown. I'm not the guest, Savannah, I said, stepping into the center of the circle. You are. And your reservation just expired. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room as the crowd of socialites stood frozen, champagne flutes halfway to their lips. Savannah's chest was heaving, her polished veneer cracking like dry plaster. This is a lie, she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. She's been in London. She hasn't touched this house in years. My parents gave me this life because I earned it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I pulled a small remote from my clutch and pointed it at the massive 85-inch television my father had mounted over my grandfather's antique mantel. The screen flickered to life, not with a slideshow of family legacy, but with the grainy high-definition night vision of my hidden security feed. The guests gasped. On the screen, time-stamped 3 nights ago, was Savannah. She was laughing as she tossed my hand-signed architectural blueprints into a black industrial shredder. Then the camera panned to my father, Silas, handing a stack of my professional portfolio books to a man in a moving uniform. "Just get rid of it," my father's recorded voice boomed through the surround sound speakers. "If it's not out by the gala, I'll burn it myself. This house needs to look like a winner's home, not a student's workshop." The mayor stepped back, his face a mask of revulsion. The real estate mogul looked at Silas as if he were a contagious disease. "That's enough," my mother shrieked, lunging for the remote. Sheriff Miller stepped between us, his hand resting firmly on his belt. "Stay back, Lydia. This is evidence of a felony, destruction of professional property and grand larceny." I walked to the mantel and placed a single sheet of heavy, bright red paper on the mahogany surface. It was the 24-hour notice to vacate. "You have until 9 p.m. tomorrow," I said, my voice cold and surgical. "Every piece of furniture you brought in, every silk rug, every bottle of wine. If it's still here when the sheriff returns, it becomes property of the estate. And since you've already destroyed my belongings to make room for yours, consider the furniture my restitution." "Choice, please," my mother whimpered, her eyes darting to her friends in the crowd. "Think of the scandal. Think of your sister's children." "I am thinking of them," I replied. "I'm thinking about the fact that they deserve to be raised by people who don't forge signatures and steal from their own blood. But they won't be staying here." I turned to the guests, who were already scurrying toward the coat check, desperate to escape the fallout. "I'm sorry the party had to end so early, but as the sole owner of the Isaac estate, the bar is officially closed." Savannah collapsed into the white sectional sofa, the one she'd bought with my grandfather's redirected pension, and buried her face in her hands. She wasn't crying for me, or for the house. She was crying because for the first time in her life, her golden pillar status had crumbled into the sea. The next evening, the silence on Blackwood Cliff was absolute. The string lights had been ripped down, the black SUVs were gone, and the only remaining sign of the Grand Heritage Gala was a single crushed appetizer napkin trapped in the sea lavender. I stood on the porch as the locksmith finished the final turn of a heavy, industrial-grade deadbolt. It wasn't a sleek keypad or a smart lock that could be hacked or bypassed. It was solid brass, keyed only to me. "Test it out, Miss Isaac," the man said, handing me a heavy ring of silver keys. I slid the key into the lock. The mechanical thud of the bolt sliding home was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in a decade. It was the sound of a boundary finally set in stone. Behind me, the house was a hollowed-out shell. In their haste to meet the sheriff's deadline, Savannah and my parents had dragged away the white sectionals and the velvet drapes, leaving behind scuff marks on the floors and empty hooks on the walls. It was messy, it was scary, and it was perfect. It was mine. I walked to the kitchen and opened the back door. Barnaby trotted out onto the porch, his joints stiff but his spirit renewed. He circled his old spot, the one-eyed scrubbed clean of the children's chalk, and let out a long, contented sigh before collapsing into a sun-warmed patch of wood. He was home. I sat on the steps beside him and pulled my phone from my pocket. There were 32 missed calls from my mother and a series of increasingly desperate texts from Savannah, ranging from vitriolic insults to pleas for a temporary loan to cover their new apartment security deposit. I didn't feel the old, familiar pang of guilt. I didn't feel the need to keep the peace by sacrificing my own pieces. I selected their numbers, one by one, and hit block. The digital silence that followed was as sweet as the ocean breeze. I looked out over the Atlantic, the waves carving the cliffside just as they had for 1,000 years. My family had called me a drifter because I didn't build my life on their shaky soil. They thought my independence was a lack of roots, never realizing that my roots went deeper than theirs, down into the bedrock of my own work and my grandfather's trust. I opened my laptop and pulled up a fresh drafting file. At the top of the screen, I typed the name of my new firm, Foundation Architecture. I had spent my life building sanctuaries for other people. It was finally time to live on my own. I looked at the empty drafting studio, envisioning the new tables, the new models, and the new legacy I would build. One that wasn't based on a name or a bloodline, but on the strength of the walls I had fought to keep standing. For 28 years, I was the girl they overlooked. Today, I was the woman who held the deed. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew one thing for certain: the locks would never be changed again.